The Tale Teller. Let me tell you a story. A storytelling podcast narrated by Glenda Villamar. Episode 8. Chapter 2, Dontin's Party, of Boone and Jacque, Saddleton's Secret, by A.G. Flitcher. Jacque sat at his uncomfortably small desk full of pencils, pens, quills, notepads, crumpled up candy wrappers, and an English breakfast tea-stained mug that said, "Long live the Queen." Dressed in his worn navy blue blazer, white dress shirt, black tie, brown corduroy pants, and thigh-high black socks, he wrote furiously. It was a beautiful Saturday, yet he decided to stay and work out the details of what he saw in the underground room that Boone and he were literally thrown into. 1,000 questions circled 1,000 times in his head. Who's the Light King? Or is he an it? Who wants all of humanity to die? Are there more tunnels? Where do they go? Who's the Dark King? Whose chair was it? I'm going to have to do some serious digging. So does Boone. His room, which was the attic, appeared dustier when the sun shone through his triangular window. The natural light carried through the room, showing the dust floating in the air above his bed. The pale pink roses stitched on his lumpy peignoir white duvet, with a pillow top to match, somehow lost its brightness in the light, whereas the nightstand and Wilmington tan-colored bookshelf shone brighter in the dark. The glass display of old artifacts Jacque wasn't permitted to touch was the only piece of furniture the light couldn't reach. As for the house itself, it was 2 floors and looked rather simple. In the little time that he'd been there, he hadn't seen much of the home. He would have seen more than his room, the kitchen, the living room, the second-floor washroom, and the laundry room, but he was only meant to go wherever he was needed. When he first came into the home, he had no idea what was going on, or what his life would be like. All he knew was that the parents were getting paid by the government to raise him. What is even more black-hearted, they thought having a foster child would make them seem more charitable and loving. In fact, to be clear that he was not part of the family, they'd give him a plate of leftovers on a metal tin pancake plate at the foot of the trap door. Only once did he ask if he could join them for dinner, to which Dontin had said, "Ha! You are no Donley boy! Oh, there is dessert, but you can't have any. Adger did quite well on his biology test, so he got the last pudding." He had then climbed down the ladder and came back seconds later with an overflowing laundry basket above his head. He had placed it next to Jacque's dinner and said, "Do the laundry when you're done eating." He had then left without saying another word. No "good night," no "I love you," no "see you in the morning." Jacque finished scribbling notes and looked out the window, feeling nothing but a humdrum atmosphere. He wished he knew what Boone was up to. Dontin didn't allow him to make personal phone calls or send letters by mail unless it had to do with school, which Jacque had to then run by him before sending it off. That was a decision Dontin had made when he caught Jacque sending personal letters in the first few months he was friends with Boone. When he had found that Boone came from a working-class family, he had to be certain that there was no bridging of classes. Despite this inescapable hurdle, Jacque cherished his relationship with Boone, maybe more than Boone even did. They got creative and came up with a system they felt was foolproof. Boone would go straight from a large maple tree branch that reached a small square next to Jacque's window. He had to be close enough to be hidden within the line of the small square so he could toss the letter through it without being seen, then monkeying away. There was no mail that day, though. However, Jacque was going to be given a task that would give him momentary relief to not have to sneak around to see Boone, which had gotten tougher since their little adventure. When he had gotten home late that night, he was locked in his room all the next day. He had asked Dontin, "What if I have to use the loo?" To which Dontin threw him a biohazard waste bucket and said, "You're welcome." Then he had thrown him a roll of toilet paper and Purell. He heard the latch of the trap door being gripped, then creaked open with Dontin's glimmering yet menacing shiny pink face. "Hello, Jacque. I have a little errand for you to do, immediately." Jacque stared at him, taking in his awful aura in farcical attire. A sky-blue striped suit, waxed and threaded eyebrows, dyed black hair with too much gel, and shiny fingernails that tapped on the noisy aged hardwood floor. In addition to that, the squeaking from the ladder he stood on amplified the lack of attention the Donleys gave to where Jacque spent most of his time when he wasn't doing chores.
"Yes, sir. Are you going out? Would you like me to do the laundry? Iron your clothes? Massage Madame Constance Rhine's feet? Clean Adger's room?"
Meh, 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 meh. Enough questions, you rabbiting child. You know you aren't allowed in the children's rooms. He took out a small envelope and beckoned Jacque towards him. Jacque got up and grabbed the letter. Dontin held on and maintained strong eye contact with him. "As you should know by now, Jacque, who we are and what we know is none of your business. But because I am now the official owner of that dingy little button factory, I'm feeling rather charitable tonight. We are having a party to celebrate my new investment. Therefore, you will send this invite to that filthy boy's father. The boy may come as well. The mayor's coming. For some waggish reason, he happens to take fondly to the poor." Jacque tugged on the invitation, but Dontin held it firmly, and then grabbed his wrist. "Do not dilly-dally with your friend. Do not talk to him, and be back in less than 5 minutes. You will have a new task waiting for you when you come back." Dontin let go of the letter and climbed back down the ladder. Jacque slipped on his shoes and followed suit as he tucked the letter into his blazer. After Jacque took the last step, Dontin rolled up the ladder and closed the trap door. He then followed Jacque, but stopped at the top of the stairs, standing with his arms crossed and a haughty grin that Jacque could feel as he descended the stairs. 5 minutes, little boy. Tardiness will not be tolerated, reiterated Dontin. Jacque returned to him momentarily to nod in agreement, and then took off quietly. When he walked out the door, he found himself muttering insults he usually wrote down in his journals or mumbled in his sleep. What a prick. Thinks he can just shoo me, ring a bell for whatever he wants, and praise stupid Adger. Poof! Did well on his biology test. He got a C-. His normal route involved hopping the fence and running to the basement door. As for his return home, it was always calculated for him to get upstairs without being seen. Usually Adger was downstairs playing his video games. Winnie would be at ballet practice with both parents, giving him a chance to clean off the evidence of him being at Boone's home. Taking the long way around was not arduous at all to him, but it took out all the merrymaking and adventure to seeing a dear friend. It was around 9 a.m. at this point, to which the sun was bright enough to keep him company. When he got to the house, he slowed down. He had never seen the front of the house. Dontin always made it clear what his thoughts were on the poor. Jacque had a much darker perception of what a poor person's house looked like. He was expecting to see a house in shambles, garbage everywhere, graffiti all over the place, and grungy stray cats hopping out of half-dead bushes. That's not to say the house was far better in reality. When he got to the driveway, the house was a fair bit smaller than what he expected. The driveway was all cracked and mossy. The pale yellow paint on the house's facade was caked in green and black mold, and the smoke coming from the chimney was coughing and spewing black coal dust. As he walked up the steps, he felt every uneven stone tipping his skinny ankle side to side. The door itself was scratched and punctured. He rang the bell, which sung faintly like a bird's chirp on a windy, rainy day. No one answered, for what felt to Jacque like 5 Laffy-Taffy stretched minutes. He saw a little handle dangling 3/4 of the length of the door. He got up on the tip of his toes and slammed it gently 3 times. All right, I'm coming, but I ain't buying squat of whatever the hell you're selling," said Crom. Jacque took a couple steps back and took out the envelope. The door opened, and an inner disgust festered under his polite demeanor. His stomach gurgled and compressed upon sight of Crom's oily blue overalls, 5 o'clock shadow filled with dandruff, and messy salt and pepper hair. Crom looked at him, as if expecting someone he didn't want to see, but then seeing someone he didn't know what to make of.
"Sir, You and Boone have been cordially invited to Dontin Donley's celebration party for his new investment of the Cronker Button Factory." He extended his hand, hoping Crom would take the invitation and say thank you. "Cordially? Oh, you're that Jacque kid, right?"
"Yes, sir."
Crom smiled and bent down towards him. He took the invitation and began to tear it into innumerable pieces. "Tell your father—"
"He's not my father."
Crom gave an impatient sigh. "Tell Dontin he can eat his invitation and I'll see him Monday." He tore it up a little more, then stuffed it into Jacque's breast pocket. Jacque never understood why adults were always so cranky and mean. The only difference he could see between Crom and Dontin was their attire and hygiene. As he had that thought, Crom gave him a foamy and gold-toothy smile, then closed the door. When Jacque got home, he went straight up the stairs to head into his room. Dontin, who was unnecessarily re-pampering himself in the nearby bathroom, caught sight of Jacque before he could reach the rope that extended the ladder. "Oi! What did the dirty man say?" He kept fixing his tie and patting his eyebrows while waiting for Jacques to answer him. Jacques let go of the rope and fished out the torn pieces of the envelope. He presented it to Dontin and said, "Mr. Crom said, tell Dontin he can eat his invitation and I'll see him Monday." Dontin looked at him in utter disbelief and smacked the torn pieces of the invitation out of his hand. As they flew up in the air, Jacques rubbed his hand. Dontin ignored the pieces falling all over the bathroom and grabbed a phone off the wall outside of the bathroom door. He dialed, vexed and determined to put a stamp on his position of power. The phone rang a few times before a groggy hello came out, just loud enough for Jacques to hear it was a woman. He had never actually met Boone's mother. "Hello, madame. This is Dontin Donley calling, owner of Cronker Button Factory. Is Crom there?" "Hold on a second. Cromie, some man named Dontin Donley wants to talk to you." "Tell that rich prick he can suck it." Jane cut him off before Dontin could hear that nasty word. "He can't come to the phone right now." Dontin huffed and said, "What a bewailing fortune. In that case, tell him if he doesn't come tonight to my party with his boy, he can say goodbye to his supervisor position and be thrown in with the workers. Oh, and feel free to come along. You sound like a delightful and formidable woman." He hung up as she made an awkward, taken-aback sound. Jacques' eyes met Dontin's, fascinated at what just transpired. "That is how you handle the poor," Dontin said. "Because unless they want to be lower than working class, they have to listen to you. Though, with women, you have to throw them a compliment. They live off it like crack. Now go help Miss Constance Rhine in the kitchen, and with anything else she might need." Jacques nodded politely and headed back down the stairs. He walked into the kitchen, which seemed to have been touched up a bit, and waited at the cusp of the hall and the black and blue tile floor. "Miss Constance Rhine, how may I help?" asked Jacques. Constance Rhine, who stood tall at 6'2", looked approachable yet elegant in a velvet, dark cherry red dressing gown. She strangely had less makeup and hair products on her than Dontin, though her perfume burned Jacques' eyes and nostrils. He could feel his nose hair shaking. It's as if a skunk spray had backfired on itself and freaked out because he had a date quite soon, masking its own musk with another that was rather fruity and unbelievably more pungent. Jacques had never seen her cook, nor what the family did for guests when they had dinners. She sat at the table, polishing utensils, then wrapping them neatly with sky-blue fabric napkins. "Polish the cutlery while I envelop them." She made no eye contact, but Jacques could see her shake a little bit. Her toned upper chest twitched as much as her lower jaw clenched and unclenched up and down. He sat in the chair next to her and began polishing with great focus, sneaking a peek or two at her auburn straight hair bounce on her collarbones whenever she would place a wrapped set of utensils. Winnie, the younger sister, came into the kitchen after half the cutlery was done. She clip-clopped with her shiny red shoes and her frilly purple dress until she stood nose to nose with Jacques, staring eagerly at him as if looking for a motive to make up rules. "Mommy, why is dusty little Jacques in the kitchen?" Constance Rhine and Jacques kept busy with their cutlery as Constance Rhine said, Well, Winnie, the mayor and some of Dad's old and new friends will be here later. So tonight, and only tonight, she eyed Jacque, who did not lift his head from the cutlery, continuing to shine and pass them to her neatly. Jacque will be helping set the table and assisting guests. If you'd like, my sweetiekins, when the party starts, you may keep him in order. If he's been a bad boy, let me or your father know. If we feel that he should be locked in his room, you and Adger can take care of it."
"Oh, goody!" Winnie was quite delighted with her new responsibility.
"See you later, little bellboy. Nyeh, 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 nyeh."
She pranced off into the hallway. Winnie had a knack for teasing and manipulating her parents into inventing new rules for both Adger and Jacque. One Jacque remembers clearly as her rule of him staying in his room unless he had chores to do. She once caught him lingering in the kitchen, looking for sugary cereal in the cupboard. Scared of Winnie, despite her being a little younger than him, he ran when she caught him. He fled the kitchen so quickly, he didn't see her tear open the box of sugary cereal he tried to steal and eat a handful. Later, she'd prove to her parents that he was misbehaving. In the few years of being in this home and enduring this juvenile injustice, he learned to keep his head down and do as he's told with no hesitation or retort. It ate at him angrily when no punishment came to the Donley children's backtalk and piggish behavior. Unlike Winnie, their parents were more forgiving of Adger when it came to swearing, backtalk, complaining, and making a mess. Constance Rhine would give him a light smack on the wrist once in a while, but she'd then apologize. Dontin did occasionally put his foot down, but for the most part, he had given up on his children listening to him and just told them off when he had the energy to do so, more so with Adger than Winnie. Constance Rhine was afraid of what she would be capable of doing as a disciplinarian. Sometimes when the children acted out horribly, she would get flashes of scarring memories of her and her siblings getting choked and slammed against coffee tables, followed by getting spanked with horsehair whips. Nevertheless, the disciplining of the Donley children was always done in private. Jacque had sometimes been able to see it in action. To him, it was more laughable than uncomfortable. However, with Constance Rhine, he had seen an odd look in her eye from time to time, as if there was this wily beast inside that she fought hard to keep being untamed. Dontin, on the other hand, had a more foreseeable tone and approach. Every time he disciplined either child, he'd maintain his firmness, but didn't expect any change to come from them. Jacque could always see the emotional fatigue in his eyes when either child scoffed at him or walked away lazily afterwards. It didn't change Jacques' view or sentiment towards him, though. Guests came in around 5:30 in the afternoon. Jacque, for only this night, was given a new outfit: a shiny black velvet suit, an eggshell-colored frill, a dress shirt, red cufflinks, black dress pants, and the ugliest old man dress shoes that reeked of strong shoe polish. His hair was cut to the nape of his neck and slicked back. He was posted near the door, while the guests came in, feeling every cold breeze and wet jacket thrown onto him. Being small, he used a little varnished stool which had uneven legs. In addition to the humiliation he felt in this obligatory post, his heart raced and teared up at the loss of his long locks of hair. He felt like part of him was gripped and ripped off without consent. Once the jackets and umbrellas were put away, he wiped his face of dirt and water, shook himself straight, and put on a phony smile as he passed by guests in the living room. He felt a hodgepodge of anger for his forced and awful haircut, and for being out of place with all the rich folk around him, and sadness for not being free to enjoy the party without having an obligatory task. To go with the theme of sky blue, frilly silk curtains were draped over the windows, and decorative fabric dressed navy blue couches till they tickled and padded the floor. Even more revolting, the coffee table was painted a shiny shade of blue that looked like a melted marshmallow peep. "I must say, Constance Rhine, you have a marvelous home," said Mayor John Winterson, a pork-bellied, scar-faced man with red and gray shoulder-length hair that rested on his right shoulder in a French braid. His suit, with blue pom-poms for buttons, made him look like he was in charge of a Willy Wonka-esque factory. "Thank you, Mr. Mayor," said Constance Rhine politely. Winnie, who was eyeing Boone and his family across the room, looked at her mother and asked in a far-fetched, cavity-giving sweet tone, "Mother, who are those sweet simpletons?" "My dear, it is not polite to speak ill of the poor. They work quite hard to get by," said the mayor. "Sorry, Mr. Mayor." She batted her eyelashes and frowned to express her so-called guilt. "Don't fret, my dear. Winnie, isn't it?" She nodded politely while keeping her little act going. "I fancy myself a brandy. Could you go and get it for me?" Jacque, who was standing so still that none of the three noticed him, felt hopeful Winnie would leave. Winnie eyed Boone and his family, who were deep in conversation with Dontin, then looked back at the mayor gleefully. "Why, of course, sir. Right away." She took off to the china cabinet in the right-hand corner of the living room. Adger, who had styled his hair to look as close as possible to Elvis Presley, and wore a simple yet elegant white-striped black tuxedo, opened a china cabinet and grabbed a bottle of brandy as Winnie pointed to it. Jacques couldn't help but stare. He had no siblings of his own, and rarely saw how they interacted. "Sweet little girl you have, Miss Constance Rhine," the mayor said. Constance Rhine smiled and nodded. They exchanged glances for a drifting second, until the mayor flinched when he caught sight of Jacques, who was no longer looking at Winnie and Adger. "Oh my, don't you look spiffy? Who might you be?" "Jacques, sir." "Jacques who?" "Just Jacques, sir." "No last name? That's ridiculous."
"Jacques is our foster child, Mr. Mayor,"
said Constance Rhine calmly. "You don't say? Well then, you must be one lucky little man, eh there, Jacques?"
"Yes, sir. Very lucky."
Jacques gave him a toothy grin. Adger walked alongside Winnie, who carried a silver tray with a glass of brandy filled halfway, and a small bucket of ice next to it. They came to a standstill, waiting for the mayor to acknowledge them.
"Jacques, please tend to our guests and tell them dinner will be starting soon,"
pleaded Constance Rhine politely. "Yes, Miss Constance Rhine." Jacques chewed on his tongue to deal with the ever-growing pot of his hodgepodge of emotions. Listening to the mayor thanking Winnie and praising their manners made him nauseous enough to swiftly turn on his heels and make his way towards Boone, his family, and Dontin. "Ah, Jacques, I'm sure you've met the Wallace family."
"Yes, sir. Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Wallace. How do you do?"
asked Jacques politely, as he shook hands with Crom and Jane, and then nodded at Boone, whom he lingered with a bit. Crom looked as if he was about to spill the fact that Boone and Jacques had kept up the intimacy of their friendship, though it seemed he might have been preoccupied with the fact that he could lose his position. "All right. Dinner will be starting soon, so Jacques, can you tend to the other guests and give them a warning for the start of dinner?"
"Yes, sir."
He fought the urge to look pleadingly at Boone, and walked back to the kitchen and grabbed a platter of champagne-filled glasses. Winnie, who stood politely and listened to a plump woman dressed in a green dress and a malnourished, freckled-faced man, looked at Jacques and said,
"Move along, bellboy."
Jacques smirked at her and slowly went about the living room, offering champagne to guests. Some accepted a glass, but others ignored him as they went about passionately talking about themselves, one of which listened patiently as Adger talked about how great his father is. The mayor, who was staring at a painting of a beautiful Dutch woman who could have easily been from the 17th century, had something shining brightly from his chest. Jacques cleared his throat and said,
"Sir, dinner will be starting soon. Would you care for some champagne?"
Mayor turned to him enough for Jacques to see that what was shining from his chest was a rather odd piece of jewelry on a necklace. It consisted of a golden baron crown, a monstrous-looking wolf with 6 tongues, and a shape-shifting light. The mayor saw him look at it and tucked it underneath his suit. "Well, if dinner will be starting soon, I should take a glass." He took one with an awkward smile, thanked him, and joined Dontin and Constance Rhine. Jacques saw Boone ask his father a question, who looked like he said, "Sure." Boone smiled excitedly and walked towards Jacques. Dontin looked at them, grumbling like he had stepped on something sharp in the middle of the night. The mayor, who was talking rather excitedly, also looked.
Let them get acquainted, Dontin. It's good for the city for the poor and the rich to be on the same side. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, same side. He wrenched himself from his fretful gaze and gave the boys and the mayor a bogus, polite smile. Jacque couldn't believe the food he saw on the table. There were mashed potatoes with sour cream and garlic butter, racks and racks of lamb served with mint jelly, bacon-wrapped scallops and Brussels sprouts, Greek salad with a raspberry vinaigrette, and other small things he couldn't quite distinguish. Everyone ate happily and talked with great appetite. Jacque was about to serve himself when the plump woman next to him gasped and looked at Dontin on her other side. "Dontin, why is your bellboy eating at the table?" Dontin looked at her curiously. "I don't have a bellboy, Lorena." "That's not what your lovely daughter, Winnie, told me." "Winnie, what have I told you about lying to our guests?" Dontin eyed Winnie wildly while trying to keep his tone firm but not loud. "Don't," replied Winnie shyly. "That's right." He turned his attention back to Lorena. "Forgive my daughter's behavior. She can be a bit bashful." Lorena smiled politely. "Jacque is our foster child." Lorena nodded and looked at Jacques. Dontin took a bite of his lamb, wiped his mouth, and then looked at Jacques. "Jacques, why don't you and Boone eat out on the porch? I'm sure the rain must have stopped by now." Jacques and Boone served themselves, then headed down the hall. Mayor Winterson cut his lamb and took a bite while looking at Dontin, as if examining a complex math problem on a chalkboard. Jacques and Boone ate quietly as crickets and frogs sounded off like a symphony, with no conductor. Jacques ate his food ravenously. Boone, who had eaten several times in the same way, looked at him bewilderingly, like an animal seeing another behave the same way as him for the first time. "Dude, why are you eating like that?" Nom nom nom, bugger off, nom nom nom." Boone raised an eyebrow, then looked behind him when he heard a faint mechanical noise. It was a small security camera with a blinking red light that focused on him. Jacques stopped stuffing his face for a second and asked Boone, "What are you looking at?" "That." He pointed to the camera. Jacques looked up and quickly wiped his mouth, and put down the rack of lamb he was chomping at like a Roman king. "Sorry, Dontin, sir." "How do you know he's watching, and that the camera has audio?" asked Boone, now looking back at Jacques. "He wouldn't leave me outside without keeping eyes and ears on me. I'm sure he'll convince someone to go outside so we're not alone for too long." He finished his meal and took out a pen and piece of paper. He drew what he could remember of what the jewelry looked like on the mayor's necklace. "What are you drawing?" asked Boone, who got up on his knees and peered over. Before Jacques could answer, the mayor came out with a cigarette and a lighter with 3 crowns on it. Jacques pocketed his drawing and pen. "Lovely night, don't you think, boys?" "Yes, sir, quite lovely," answered Jacques. "How about you, Boone?" The mayor puffed a cigarette and then pocketed his lighter. "Same." Dontin slid the door open, looked at Jacques, and said, "Jacques, go help Constance Rhine with dessert. Lucky for you, our guests have manners and cleaned up after themselves." The mayor looked at Dontin calculatedly, then smiled and looked back into the night sky. Dontin smirked at him and slid the door closed. Jacques and Boone took their plates inside while the mayor finished his cigarette. When the mayor saw that they were inside, he walked about the porch and stomped his cigarette out. Without seeing the security camera, he leaned over and picked up his cigarette butt, tossing it in an ashtray mounted quite close to the camera. When he did so, his necklace slid out of his suit, causing the reflection of the blinking red light to bounce off his necklace. It grabbed his attention so strongly that he felt his heart palpitate momentarily. He tucked his necklace back in, took a deep breath, and exhaled as he walked to the half-open door. "Oh, rice pudding," he said, sliding the door closed behind him. You can find the book Boone and Jacque, Saddleton's Secret on Amazon.com. A.G. Flitcher is a writer out of British Columbia. Be sure to give A.G. Flitcher a follow on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube. Thank you for listening. We'll be back soon with a new tale to tell.